Well, good morning. My name is Tim Eberhardt. I'm assistant professor of theology and ecology here at Garrett-Evangelical Theological Seminary. And I am so pleased to welcome you here today and to welcome back the Reverend Dr. Ventra Asana to campus. Dr. Asana, an alum, will be speaking to us today on ecological ministry as spiritual healing in the African American beloved community. Followed by, and she will guide us or direct us, followed by an eco-labyrinth meditation in our Chapel of the Unnamed Faithful just down the hall. Now I want to offer a special welcome to those of you who have joined us from Evanston and surrounding communities. In particular, two new friends, Janet Alexander and Dorothy Head. I have joined the Environmental Justice Committee in Evanston, and I know both Janet and Dorothy, who have been working for many years through this committee and others to address a particular environmental injustice here in Evanston, located at the waste transfer station on Church Street, affecting both the 5th and 2nd Ward communities here in Evanston. The waste transfer station fits into a broad pattern, a consistent pattern of finding garbage dumps, waste sites, toxic sites, and other spaces of environmental degradation, predominantly communities of color, neighborhoods, regions. And so I am honored to be joining the two of them in this work, not just to raise awareness, but ideally someday to see the closing of that transfer station. I expect there will be many opportunities for this community to be engaged in the coming year in that work. So a special welcome to the two. So this morning's lecture is sponsored by sustainGETS at Garrett-Evangelical. sustainGETS forming initiative focused on promoting ecological consciousness and integrating sustainable practices. The life of the communities that we serve. Now, central to an ecological perspective is the capacity to see connections, relationships. And for us here at the seminary, that means seeing the connections between ecological harms like water, air, soil pollution, climate disruption, and more, and other forms of violence like white racism, sexism, economic inequality, and the extractive flow of resources from poor rural to wealthy urban spaces. It also means working to connect movements, traditions, communities in a common pursuit of healing and justice, of regeneration. So you can expect many opportunities to learn and engage through sustainGETS in the coming years. With that, I am happy to note that this is the very first sustainGETS sponsored lecture, the first of many to come. And we could not have been gifted with a more fitting inaugural lecturer than the Reverend Dr. Ventra Asana. Dr. Asana is an ordained clergy elder in the 4th Episcopal District of the African Methodist Episcopal Church in the Detroit Annual Conference. She is a graduate of Cass Technical High School in Detroit, Michigan, and holds a BA degree in interdisciplinary film study from Wayne State. In 1999, Dr. Asana obtained a Master of Divinity in the Cooperative Theological Seminary in Detroit and Garrett-Evangelical, and then in 2000 earned her Master of Theological Studies here at the seminary. writing a master's thesis titled Theology, African Caribbean Women in the Image of God. More recently, in 2014, she received her doctorate of ministry from Ecumenical Theological Seminary with a dissertation here on the ground, community gardens as spaces of calm in African American communities of light. I already told you I'm looking forward to reading a copy. Dr. Asana has traveled for many years to various countries individually and with other clergy, bringing relief and assisting with sustainable development programs. In the Dominican Republic, she has worked alongside members of Al-Falit, a non-government organization to assist men and women living on the edges of sugarcane plantations. In Bolivia, Dr. Asana has worked with the Amara and Quechua peoples to make bricks, lay sod, and dispense medicines. And in India, she has observed women's micro-business development cooperatives. In 2004, Dr. Asana secured a year-long internship under the tutelage of Brother Rick Samin, former director of the Earthworks Urban Farm in Detroit. While there, she helped coordinate learning opportunities for children in the urban farming program, learned beekeeping, and other techniques in planting, harvesting, and composting. Through her company, WUE Workshop in Urban Ecology, Dr. Asana trains faith communities in eco-ministry programs, preaches and teaches on divine earth care, and conducts labyrinth walks for eco-awareness. In October 2016, she accepted a position as coordinator at Michigan Interfaith and Light. You can see why I'm so excited to have her here. Dr. Asana, welcome back, and thank you not just for this morning's presentation, but for your many years of work on behalf of God's Great Commission.
Well, I think you've heard all you need to hear, and now we can all go home. First of all, I want to say that I'm very honored and very thrilled at Tim's invitation to have me come and speak. And I'm glad I didn't know that I was the inaugural lecturer because I may have changed my mind. I have very fond memories of being here, and I see faces that I'm familiar with. Dr. Rector, who was my professor, Dr. Jack Seymour, learned so much from. Of course, Cheryl Anderson and I see each other at American Academy of Religion gatherings on occasion. Um, Reverend Deborah Williams is a good friend of mine. We suffer together here. And Jane Lionberger, Reverend Jane Lionberger, who is a very, very good, dear sister friend. So happy to be here and share with you. I want to hazard a guess and say, excuse me, sir, what is your name in the green shirt? Matthew. Okay, I'm glad I didn't say it because you look like a guy I dated. Wow, and I'm glad I dodged that bullet. Okay. So let me just begin, if I may. And I have allowed time for questions and answers. I have a mailing sign-in sheet here, and I'm going to give you just one little exercise at the very end if you need further information. I want to thank Dr. Timothy Eberhard for his gracious invitation to celebrate Black History Month with you at my alma mater, Garrett-Evangelical Theological Seminary, and to commemorate this special time with the church and the Black experience. I am very amazed at the work that sustainGETS is doing here, particularly the LEED certification. I'm actually staying in Loder Hall while I'm here, and I tell you, it was not like that when I left here. Sensor lights and the climate in the room, everything is just wonderful. And to find out that You actually have geothermal heating, um, wall and roof insulation, and then even the toilet is a dual flush commode. These are the kinds of things that we are promoting to the churches in Detroit and the mosques and the synagogues, and I'll get to that later, but I'm so amazed and so grateful that I had a chance to study here. I want to talk to you today on the topic ecological ministry as spiritual healing in the African American beloved community. As is the case for much of ministry commitment, in my role as an ecology minister, eco minister for short, I haven't always known where the path would lead in service to my work. For example, as a board member of Michigan Interfaith Power and Light, I recently stepped off the board and took a temporary staff position for 13 weeks to partner with Detroit faith communities around the issue of a newly imposed storm water drainage fee. The fees are so excessive that their operating budgets are now severely threatened, and some may be forced to close their doors. Churches and mosques are now meeting regularly to challenge the city's water department for the cost of $750 per impervious acre of surface area of a facility's parking lot. That is to say that if your church or mosque has a parking lot that is 3.26 acres and it is multiplied by $750 per acre, the cost to your church or mosque is $2,445 per month. An impervious lot is one in which the storm water does not seep through to the water table or the aquifer, but instead runs off the lot and into the city's stormwater drains. I am not an engineer, but I have steeped myself in the mechanics and specifics of how to mitigate storm water drainage. Though I am not an engineer, as an ecology minister, I am privileged to partner with these churches and mosques to bring information about bioretention resources to offset stormwater costs in the form of building rain gardens, installing rain chains and rain barrels, and even structures like bioswales, a method of landscaping that captures the rain and allows it to permeate through to the water table or aquifer. These remedies assist faith communities to achieve a reduction in their overall stormwater drainage fees owed to the city of Detroit. Over the past 15 years, the shape of ecological ministry that I have practiced has morphed into encouraging congregations to practice recycling and plant gardens to the kinds of technical matters that I just mentioned. Ecological ministry is not just theoretical, but also a practical theology that requires one to flow between the four walls of the church and the literal landscape of the community, working with the African American beloved community in places that are stripped bare and ravaged by the vicissitudes of urban development schemes that displace entire communities and disrupt the cultural cohesiveness of daily life. And thus, for me, the key aspect of an engaged ecological ministry must situate itself in the theoretical framework that begs response to two questions. First, what is the construct of an ecological ministry that can speak to the continual and seemingly unremitting devastation of Black lives in the blighted urban landscape? And second, what are the resources that can make such an ecological ministry viable to the extent that churches will undertake the work? So let's look at a moment at theoretical framework. As the ground of my pedagogical and theological agency, I am constrained to support, work on behalf of, and keep in prayer at all times the beloved community of African American spaces. It is not that I disdain other cultural and actual spaces, for I endeavor to love and serve all humanity at God's disposal for my life. But I am particularly compelled to restore the spaces of the African American community because societal constructs systematically conspire to destroy them. When I say, quote unquote, beloved African American community, I am in the company of many African American women, such as Toni Morrison, Bell Hooks, and the firebrand Joy James, author of Seeking the Beloved Community, so that I join the crowd of witnesses who strive to rebuild African American communities under siege. At the outset, it is helpful to consider the nature of ecological ministry, or eco ministry as I see it. I describe eco ministry as an intentional focus to promote connections between spirituality and deep ecology. And I have a slide here for you. I should also add this notion of what is bioregionalism. I'll start with deep ecology. Deep ecology is people's responses and proactive encounters to live ecologically friendly on Earth. The well-being and flourishing of human and non-human life on Earth, and the diversity of life forms that contribute to these values. And this is from Duvall and Sessions. Now, I do have a resource for further study. Duvall and Sessions is not on there, but if you sign my mailing list, I will be happy to give you further references. When we look at bioregionalism is, is an area that can be seen as culture specific in terms of how we can look at African American urban space, and particularly blighted African American urban space. Sell says it is a life territory, a place defined by its life forms, its topography, and its biota. In other words, what flourishes there, the flora and the fauna, rather than by human dictates. It is a region that is governed by nature, not legislature. It is helpful to look at these two areas of ecological language. Whether in a rural or urban setting, deep ecology looks at what soils, water resources, natural plants, insects, and animals are in that space. And certainly when we're talking about urban space, whether it's Detroit, Newark, New Jersey, whether it's Harlem, Gary, Indiana, or any urban space where people of color and poor people, generally speaking, what we will find is that we have a consistent pattern of what some call urban renewal and I call urban removal. And so when we're looking at ecological language, rarely do those progenitors of that discourse speak of urban space in the consideration of what are its soils, water sources, natural plants, insects, and animals. And yet these things flourish, as we know, in urban spaces. We know that this happens. I mean, I can come out of my house and everybody on my block knows not to do anything to harm the bees. The bees and the butterflies. I will hurt you. But there's more. I'm constantly surprised when I come out on a spring day and I see a blue jay. And I'm like, what? A blue jay in Detroit? But they're here. It's not just a park or our great state park now, Belle Isle, where you have all people coming and they're birding, but in an everyday space of just being on the street. Melded to Christianity and other religious practice, deep ecology considers how God's people may become responsible stewards of good ecology practices. So then, a viable Christian eco ministry seeks to help believers consider God's call to take care of the earth as they respond to sustainable methods. These methods include alternative energy sources such as solar energy, geothermal energy, wind power, and other renewable energy sources, as well as modes of recycling, reducing, and reusing materials to lessen waste on the planet, what's called the carbon footprint. As I mentioned earlier, it also includes resources like conservation of water. Eco-ministry also includes sustainable agricultural practices, such as urban farming and community gardening, organic gardening methods using composting, apiarists or beekeepers, and other elements. And in the city of Detroit, we are serving as a model for the nation and even the world. We have over 1,400 community urban farms and gardens. Um, Even though blight is a problem, in a way, it's a positive thing in that we have some of the healthiest bees in the entire nation because we use our organic farming methods. And so people come on our urban farm tours every year in August. We have busloads of people coming from all over the country to observe what is it that we are doing right in terms of safeguarding bee populations, among other things. Thus far, these forms may not seem particularly culture specific as to how an ecological ministry can take place, for there are innumerable faith communities nationally and globally that are doing ecology work. To be sure, the difficulty of engaging this work in the African American beloved community is that with the myriad social problems that beset it, the intentional engagement of an earth care ethic often goes lacking. Thus, it becomes imperative to first identify contributing factors that destroy the beloved community to understand what is at stake. Only then can we have an analytical framework with which to examine the destruction in the hope of arresting it and working to restore to wholeness both the ravaged landscape and the lives that reside within it. To construct an ecological ministry that can disrupt the continual and seemingly unremitting devastation of Black lives in the blighted urban landscape, it is crucial to understand the function and definition of urban spaces. We can garner a better consideration of it by utilizing the concepts of place theory and place ethics. Place theory looks at beliefs that make distinctions between space as generic in the urban landscape and the ways people move within that landscape and what kinds of emotional attachments they make to that landscape. In other words, if we have a situation where urban planners come in and say, this is all blighted area here, we're going to tear all these houses down. There may be, in the case of Detroit, there may be 2 houses on a block that are viable houses where people are living, and 7 houses on the block that are scheduled for demolition. And so urban planners, in looking at that land, they fly drones over and they do the topographical analysis. They may say, well, we need to get rid of this block because there's 7 houses that need to be torn down and only 2 houses where people are living there. However, there is no consideration of how people are looking at their space in the social dynamic and how their community is built. Then we have a situation of place ethics, a system of principles involving fundamental ethical dimensions to the ways we treat places. In other words, how we use and affect natural and cultural space and human, non-human lives that occupy these spaces. Place theory, as an economic theoretical concept, examines the function of cities within capitalistic markets. And I want to go back for a moment. The notion of place and its significance to inner city residents is multifaceted. Place theory actually comes from economic reflections on how a city can best serve capitalist uses. It thus becomes pertinent to examine how residents of poor neighborhoods feel about the places where they live. Place theory as an economic theoretical concept looks at capitalistic markets wherein the city is essentially construed as a marketplace commodity that exhibits a political economy, and this is Moloch. Within the city, commerce is exchanged so that people can carry on their lives. However, the city is not just an economic entity, for it also exists for most of its residents in the realm of social phenomenon. Logan and Moloch posit that the city is not merely a marketplace commodity, but also one that provides social interactions between people that help build relationships and imbue place with meaning. However, these social meanings will differ based on how the city space is used. At its crux, place has a use value as a home for residents and an exchange value as generating rent for the owners. Thus, residents who are not homeowners, or even sometimes those who are homeowners, may not have enough political agency to challenge power brokers who, in their spaces, see this space only as a marketplace commodity for rent. Using this analytical model, Logan and Malik give shape to the oppositional agendas between entrepreneurs and residents. In other words, well-resourced residents who may or may not be entrepreneurs use the city as a place marker in ways that may set them in opposition to those who are too poor to move out of certain areas. Additionally, well-resourced residents decide where they live based on how they can best employ local resources. Entrepreneurs make the same kinds of decisions, but they do so also based on the fact that they may live outside the community. And so we come to understand the tensions that continually arise when areas that are blighted begin to get gentrified. So the city is an economic construction meant to provide the highest financial remuneration possible for its builders at the expense of the poor, who often are used as fodder in the enterprise. How do African Americans who live in blighted spaces feel about it? It is important to ascertain this and how it signifies, to examine the lived meaning that people associate with the places where they live. The concept of place ethics provides these kinds of examinations. In place theory, the term healing gardens can be defined as a space to look out and a space for passive or quasi-passive activities such as observing, listening, strolling, sitting, exploring, and so on. This is Marcus and Barnes. Hosking and Haggard reference Robert Ulrich in his study of accelerating healing, demonstrated in a group of patients exposed to the beauty of gardens, and a control group that was not privy to them. The former group experienced greater healing, while the latter grew sad and healed slower. While the vast corpus of literature on African American space speaks of it in highly pejorative terms, in a more affirmative view, Jane Jacobs, argues that healthy cities must entertain structures that promote vitality to provide safety for people in their spaces of living. And here she differentiates between safe and unsafe spaces, positing that there must be cooperation in neighborhoods utilizing three main categories. First, there must be a clear demarcation between public space and private space. Public and private spaces cannot ooze into each other as they do typically in suburban settings. Secondly, there must be eyes on the street in terms of buildings that face the street and people on the street. The buildings on a street are equipped to handle strangers and to ensure the safety of both residents and strangers. And so the building must be oriented to the street so that there are eyes on the street. Buildings cannot turn their backs or blank sides to the street and leave it blind, for in doing so, crime proliferates and people are left unprotected. Third, the sidewalks must have users on them fairly often as another means of eyes on the street. The sidewalk must have users on it fairly continuously, both to add to the number of effective eyes on the street and to induce the people in buildings along the street to watch the sidewalk in sufficient numbers. Now, when I was growing up, we had eyes on the street all over the place. And, I see people nodding their head. You could leave one part of your block, and before you got to the end of the street, if you were doing something wrong, everybody on the block knew about it, and there were no cell phones or social media. Always someone was watching, even when you didn't see them. While you see a little curtain moving, somebody's watching. And what really shocks me is in my folly, I retired from 20 years of clergy ministry, 17 years in the United Methodist Church, and then the last 3 years ordained as an elder in the AME Church, and then shortly after that retired as an adjunct professor teaching world religion from Henry Ford College. And I'm saying, oh, this is my time of retirement. I can do some eco ministry, and I can do this, and I went and bought a 100-year-old house in the hood. On my street is 2 blocks long, and on my part of that one block there are maybe 5 houses with people living in them, and at least 7 or 8 houses that are blight, scheduled for demolition. All right? And I am amazed, and because of the blighted areas where all of this undergrowth, this brush is growing up, people have to walk in the street. And I could not figure out for the longest time why people were walking in the street. Even when the sidewalk is clear, they still walk in the street. So I still haven't figured that out. But what I have discovered is that even on my block with these issues of blight, there are people who are exhibiting eyes on the street. They know when it's time for my garbage to be taken out, and I'm the only one on the block with a blue recycle bin, so I'm hoping to change that. I come home and the can is out, the recycle bin is out. I come back home, it's back in. So somebody is watching. This is what we have lost in these avenues of blight. Another positive viewpoint on urban living is offered by Glasser, Parker, and Hong, who posit that statistics of urban planning policymakers don't go far enough to determine the attitudes of community residents in these enclaves who are committed to affirmative activism and better quality of life issues. Glasser provides substantial evidence that place is extremely important to residents, regardless if others deem their neighborhoods as desolate or blighted. These residents do not focus on the poverty of the community, but rather view it as the urban place where they live, particularly those who are connected through the bonds of friendship, family, and community, and thus are less likely to see the world outside their enclave, even if it's beautiful, even if it's the suburbs, as an attractive option, and as a result are expected to become willing contributors to community improvement. In other words, it can look, as we sometimes say, toe up from the flow up. And people want to live there because they know Mrs. Jackson is down the street, and Stan, the lineman, will get your lawn done, and there's an informal economy, and somebody needs some butter. I mean, like in the old days. So we cannot automatically assume that because we do a drive-by and we see houses that are slated for demolition, that there is no viable community life there. While it is easy to write off blighted communities, place theory and place ethics suggest that it is imperative that urban residents have agency to express their attachment to such areas. The second question that I want to address is, what are the resources that can make such an ecological ministry viable to the extent that churches will undertake this ecological work? Moving from theory to praxis, an engaged methodology that looks at calmness in the garden. In my dissertation, I did an exploration of the community gardening practices of 5 elderly African American women. As an eco-minister myself and practicing urban farmer, I was intrigued to discover their experiences. Each of the women worked both in the urban farm garden as well as their own personal gardens at one time or another. The gardens in which the women work are located in neighborhoods that appear as inhospitable to a good quality of life, bordered by abandoned buildings and lots strewn with tires, household garbage, and hazardous materials. Not only is it difficult to imagine how such regions can be seen as places of goodwill and neighborly refuge, but some would argue that beauty here is non existent. However, the women consistently mention the tranquility that they experience when they are working in the garden because it is a place of beauty. It was as though the gardening experience obliterated the existing blight, serving as a liminal space that situates them in the mystery of God, for they often spoke of God in the experience of gardening. And liminal space speaks to psychological or spiritual spaces, especially in nature, wherein unusual or strange happenings may occur as a result of removing oneself from everyday noisy life. We find this often in Shakespeare's characters when a change comes about when the person moves from one space into the natural space of the forest, the liminal, the paranormal. It is the lure of the garden as a theological space, especially when we ask, how important is the reflection of beauty in the midst of urban decay? The notion of the recovery of beauty as a much-needed aesthetic to restore blighted neighborhoods is also theological in scope for urban dwellers. I argue that a striking parallel exists between the ravaged body of Jesus Christ hanging on the cross and the ravaged landscape of an African American community that suffers from urban blight. In his discussion of the wasted earth and Christ's body, Wallace says, as the God who knows death through the cross of Jesus is the crucified God, so also is the Spirit who enfleshes divine presence in nature is the wounded spirit. Jesus' body as God's enfleshed presence was inscribed with the marks of human sin, so also the earth body of the Spirit is lacerated by continued assaults upon our planet home. And I look at this paralleling Wallace's work, Earth as Cruciform, the theology of blighted landscape. So what Wallace is saying is that we have a parallel between what Christ suffered on the cross in terms of ravage, destruction, woundedness, and what we see when we move through the blighted, decimated, devastated urban space of blight. I think that's phenomenal. In this reflection, it becomes possible to call the church to an urgent agenda. We must call the church to the divine task of recovering the broken urban landscape to the redemptive ground of ecological wholeness as an honor to the once suffering but now risen Christ. I argue that this must compel members of the body of Christ to remember that just as Christ was crucified, rose again, and gathers each person into redemptive wholeness, the ravaged earth, this ravaged, blighted urban landscape, and the broken lives that reside within its bounds must also be gathered into wholeness. To promote healing in African American landscapes of blight, I offer three things that can assist this salvific work. 1. Engaging contemplative practice, such as the labyrinth, in open spaces. 2. Teaching and preaching on the mandate, not as a mere suggestion, but as the God-inspired mandate to undertake divine earth care. And 3. Engaging a mode of intentionality of earth care praxis. Overwhelmingly, the bulk of my eco-ministry praxis over the last 12 years has been in urban farming. But ecological ministry is expansive and able to shape itself to the particularities of culture-specific needs of each community. So it can be bioretention, geothermal heating, wind and solar, beekeeping, cultivating mushrooms, farm-to-table partnerships, and on and on. We're not going to run out of work. before Jesus comes. At present, I am working with partners in Detroit to build an earth oven so that our neighbors and friends can bake their bread at home, then bring it to the community garden to bake it in the oven. We are excited about now when I first offered this suggestion, usually when I offer a suggestion in my little cooperative groups, people's eyes kind of glaze over and they get a nervous tick, and I have to wait a few months till things kind of settle down, and then they'll see it on YouTube or something and say, oh, okay, yeah, let's do that. So I'm slowly learning to be patient. We are excited about the prospect of yet another way to build cohesiveness in the beloved community. The church must grow to partner with ecological practitioners, and in so doing will find itself moving into the divine space of avant-garde ministry and not rearguard cluelessness. It is time to cultivate new growth to advance God's kingdom. Finally, I would like to leave you with a last word on what I feel is crucially required to provide spaces of healing for the African American beloved community in blighted landscapes. I propose a call to eco-womanist engagement. All too often, Black lives are deemed unimportant and rendered as invisible to almost every facet of society, including urban ecology narratives. A radical change is needed to usher in the moral agency of African Americans in their daily experiences of urban ecology encounter. Womanist theologies can provide such a challenge. First, a womanist theology of liberation, as applied to eco-theologies, would make room for an authentic retelling of how African American how they experience ecological change within the urban environment, and what means they use to promote community and homemaking in the face of their environmental challenges. Now, I'm going to put just a little pause here. I'm sometimes asked why I don't automatically zero in on environmental racism. Environmental racism is real, and I know you ladies can attest to that because you're working in environmental justice. But I am looking for affirmative areas, ways to bring a sense of what I like to call interiority with a capital I, interiority. And by that I mean to say I can substitute the pejorative nomenclature of inner city and as a place that is dejected, that is, nobody wants to be there, all the murders, and then you look at Chicago, and is it Chicago or is it, I got family on South Side and I'll be there tomorrow. Is it Chicago or is it Chirac? Or is it Detroit or is it the murder capital? And so by looking at this idea of urban spaces in the African American beloved community rather than inner city with all of its negative imagery, adopting a stance of interiority, going into the interior where culturally you are renewed, revitalized, and restored. And I give as an example, I was telling Tim a little earlier, I recently moved from West Bloomfield. My mother passed and we were taking care of her out there. Moved from West Bloomfield back to Detroit. And as I said, my block is, hey, it's going to take a lot of work. But I'm struck by the contrast. Yes, you have an absolutely wonderful aesthetic in West Bloomfield. It's bucolic, there's all of this beautiful landscape and everything, but it's dead space for me culturally. Because I could stand in our subdivision and I could roll a bowling ball through that subdivision and I wouldn't hit anybody but the landscape guy. I'm not going to smell any barbecue. I'm not going to see people walking either on the street or in the street, And so there's a trade-off. That's not to say that it's not an either or, it's a both and. There's a way to bridge connection and building between the beautiful spaces and the not so beautiful spaces, and thereby we all benefit. Second, A womanist liberative theological construct acts as a theoretical framework to raise questions about oppression not only in the community but also in the church. Just as the centuries-long oppression of African American women has been addressed in myriad womanist conversations, the same must be applied to the current challenges found in urban ecology encounter. Thus, effective new opportunities arise for the church to pioneer community building as they partner with residents to restore the broken, blighted landscape in homage to Jesus Christ. Finally, last word. Finally, the church can lead the way to recover rituals of earth-keeping in the urban environment. Let us consider deeply how we can devise rituals around harvest in community gardens and farms. Let us celebrate in liturgy and through sacraments, through dance, rap, hip-hop, preaching, food, and song, borrowing from the idea of a socio-religious praxis and seeing it as the means to heal the wounds of the community caused by environmental racism and other ills. How might these practices look? I was given an opportunity to bring a healing ceremony to a community farm gathering 2 years ago, and so I engaged a ceremony of Ma'afa. For those of you who don't know what Ma'afa is, it is a ritualistic ceremonial space in which we all dress in white and we remember the problem and the brutality of the transoceanic slave trade and those who were lost. And we pour libation and we pray to God and we offer healing not just for the African American beloved community, but also anyone who will join us across race, class, culture, all of these divides, and try to find a place of cohesiveness in healing for everyone. That's one way. Another way is that I have recently developed an eco-ministry field education program at Ecumenical Theological Seminary in which those who are going into ministry can engage with intentionality ways to expand this field of ecological ministry and divine earth care and looking at what does God say on the subject in that faith tradition and how can we move from theory to praxis. And thirdly, recently I've been asked to present an eco-ministry education workshop at this year's Diaconia World Federation gathering, which will be in Chicago. And so the workshop will be a further opportunity or expansion for us to go into small groups. And what I'm always very blessed is that to receive is that I have information, but I only have a modicum. And so I always say when I teach or preach, I say to the students or the parishioners that I'm always thinking about the Imago Dei, the likeness and image of God, and that I find my completeness in you, you find your completeness in me. Now, on occasion, that's gotten me in trouble because when I've stood before predominantly European American United Methodist churches and say, good morning, church family, nothing. And then I keep repeating. After a while, they say, and then I would say, I invite you into the holy blackness of God. Nothing. I invite you into that, okay? Because when I look in your face and I see a white complexion, and you look into my face and you see a dark-skinned black complexion, both of those are the likeness and image of God. That is the Imago Dei. And so there's opportunity for us to engage in this healing. The church can partner with existing urban ecology organizations to plant trees, to build parks, and to plant gardens. The churches can distribute seeds, promote farmers markets, spearhead avenues of community-supported agriculture, such as food co-ops, even on a small scale. As celebration has united Black people throughout the generations and through much oppression, I suggest that community celebration led by the church has the potential to offer new avenues of cohesion and solidarity. This is much needed in the urban environment, moving from the stasis of the bricks and mortar of buildings to the living, vibrant earth. In this way, Ecological ministry can dramatically change what it means to inhabit God's green earth in the urban spaces of the African American beloved community. Thank you.
So pleased that I said not a word to you about this being an inaugural lecture. If you had, it would have been a great loss. This was precisely the foundation for future conversation for us here. Thank you.
That's not my theory. That's the theory of Jane Jacobs. What she is saying is that you have a situation between the suburb and the urban space, and that in the suburb, a lot of times it's because of the money, the economic dynamics that are attached to that property and so forth and so on. Even though it may be public space, it's sometimes construed as private space. But again, that's her theory, and I would invite you to read her work because she's phenomenal in that regard. Okay, the field education program would be such that students would for example, a Catholic Church is phenomenal in its energy conservation methods. They have a rain garden. They have a bioswale that retains the storm water. Technology. They have they put in permeable paving before the situation with the Detroit storm. I mean, they've had it in for about 5-6 years, so they've seen ahead of the working in partnership in the Catholic community with the Pope's edict, the Laudato Si. That would be a perfect place for students, but there are others, and so what I wanted to do was find out and put ministry students in touch with that as a site of beginning to understand and form their own ecological ministry. Okay, well, first of all, that's not the crux of my eco-ministry. My eco-ministry work is to form eco-ministry green teams in churches. And then as an eco-ministry green coach, if you will, we help them to identify what areas of energy conservation that they want to undertake. It may be a church garden, it may not. It may be that they want to have, they might want to do aquaponics, which is fish farming, or they may want to do any number of things. So I don't actually go in the early part of my eco ministry. First of all, I had never heard of eco ministry, and so I'm still kind of parsing that. But anyway, God's got a great sense of humor. But anyway, early in my work, I would try and get churches to do a garden. And in answer to that question, there was a lot of pushback. And I couldn't quite understand what it was. But in my because of the ancestral memory, if you will, over many generations of moving from the south to the north, upward mobility does not dictate that one goes back to the dirt. Upward mobility dictates that one continues to strive upwardly and become upwardly mobile. And so all the accoutrements that speak to that, one is very contained, one doesn't do call and response in church and give an amen or whatever it might be. Certainly we don't want to go back to the farm situation because we tried to escape from that. So that's one of the pushes. So what I have discovered is that I had to change my tactic, talk to younger people who get it and don't have all of that baggage associated with the Great Migration and the Second Migration and all that stuff. So, but to answer that question in terms of where I am right now, I see ecological ministry as expansive, and it's not just gardening or farming. If you don't want to dig in the soil, well, guess what? You can deal with stormwater drainage, or we can look at. We've got zip cars in Detroit now. We've got electric bikes in Detroit. I don't even hardly know Detroit sometimes when I go downtown, and I'm loving it. I was telling Tim, I feel like I'm living back in New York or something. So it's a progressive and expansive thing. But yes, there is a lot of pushback, and even some people have said we're tired of all these urban farms and community gardens just turn Detroit into a plantation. So you're always going to get some pushback. And my job as an ecology minister is not to overlay what I think a community should have on top of them, but rather to sit and listen beneath the noise to kind of try to ascertain, well, what are the real issues and what is it that people really want. Can I give them this exercise? Okay, if I may just do, yes, a couple of things. I am going to ask you all to please take up this post-it and write what you would like to see in terms of ecological ministry. Aaron, do you mind doing that? What you would like to see in ecological ministry, and make sure that I get these back. And I have a mailing list. If there's further information that you would like, please put your information on this. For further study, there is a reference sheet here, and here's my business card, so please avail you. Now, yourself. Now, in terms of the labyrinth piece, I have been told that at my request, the labyrinth has been set up in the chapel, and you are free to go to the chapel. There is a resource sheet there for you to take some dirt from a bowl and consider it. It's a dirt liturgy. Just consider it for a moment. And you can either hold the dirt in your hand as you walk through the labyrinth and consider what soil means to you, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, or whatever it means. And you can walk through the labyrinth with that, or you can just take the dirt, consider it, and put it back in the bowl, and then go through the labyrinth. So I invite you to do that at your leisure. And I thank you so much once again for the opportunity. Thank you.